Hello, everyone. Welcome to the official first episode of Totaltext Live. We are absolutely busting with a total of 0 viewers at the moment. Hopefully, I'll change that if I could just promote this a little bit on Twitter. But, you know, that's all right. We're all right. We're rolling with it. My guest today is Daniel Ruefman, and he is an all-around awesome guy. He still teach at Wisconsin Stout, right?
University of Wisconsin Stout, yeah.
Sweet. Tell us a little bit about what you do there.
I guess they tell me I'm an associate professor of rhetoric and composition. I was a former director of the first-year comp program here, and I currently teach all things writing, technical writing, professional communications, qualitative research methods, creative writing, pretty much anything that says writing on it or it can be worked into writing in some way, shape, or form. I pretty much handle that.
You are living the dream.
Sure.
I mean, I am in awe. Now, tell us a little bit about, and talked with you about this before, and I'm very excited to kind of spread the word about it. Tell us a little bit about the Hitch Lit Review.
Okay, the Hitch Lit Review kind of grew out of this notion. It's a secular literary magazine, all right, and it grew out of this idea that when I was, as a poet, I submit to a lot of journals, and I find that a lot of journals tend to, even by accident, work religious ideology into the poetry that they select, even though they're not necessarily identifying as religious, publications. There seems to be always a series of poems that invokes the supernatural, and I decided that when founding the Hitch Lit Review, I wanted to make sure that we had a space for people who kind of rejected the notions of the supernatural. It's for people who are openly secular, atheist, agnostic, those kinds of folks, and to give them a space for their voices so that they don't have to kind of conform or feel like they are pressured to conform to the supernatural ideologies that are embraced by their magazines.
You know, it's funny. I'm really, really interested in that because so when you would see these religious themes coming across these journals, were they weren't anti, they were pro-religious sentiment?
For the most part, yeah. There are a handful of journals out there. The names are escaping me right now, but yeah, there are a handful of secular magazines out there that are embracing atheism or secularism in various shapes and forms, whatever that means. But for the most part, especially publications that are loosely affiliated, maybe they're housed by a university that that's affiliated with a religious organization. They, even when they're not embracing the religious ideologies specifically for themed issues, they still kind of favor poems that invoke the supernatural in some way.
I'm floored. I mean, I'm starting to think that, they talk about the echo chamber and they talk about like that personal bubble. I just kind of always assumed that everyone who was interested in poetry would be in some way or another like the God's Not Dead professor.
Oh. No, surprisingly not. I've lived in a few different states now, right? And I grew up in Pennsylvania. I lived in Georgia for a bit. That's where we met, right? And then I moved to Wisconsin. And in each of these communities, faith kind of plays into things. Even in my publishing life, it seems like even when I have something published by somebody, a lot of times they engage with me, and religion somehow works itself into the fold.
Wow.
Poems, it seems like a lot of people, when they look at poetry, there is this desire to seek some higher purpose, and so often that higher purpose turns into a religious discussion.
Man, I've learned something today. This actually kind of leads into one of the other questions I wanted to ask you, because I mean, I've had a few successes here and there with poetry and writing. I've had my publications, but what I've found with poetry for me, and this might not be the universal experience, but poetry for me has always been the most difficult to get into. It's incredibly frustrating. And so like now that you have been brewing this journal, I was wondering if, as an editor, what would you have any advice for people who are not just submitting to your magazine, but are submitting to other magazines all over the place? What pointers would you give them?
Every publication is going to be different. So if you're submitting to a publication, you want to make sure that you really familiarize yourself with their submissions guidelines. Because for Hitchlit, for our inaugural issue, which was published in September, we had, I want to say, 245 submissions for poetry. We accepted, I think, 15 or 16 poems.
Gotcha.
So that was a big pool that was very competitive, and we have a rolling submission policy. So we also, even after we were considering for this initial, we kept on getting more and more and more. The vast majority of our submissions are poetry. The easiest way for any journal to start to cut is if you do not follow their submission guidelines. So some journals will say you have to have your name on each page. Some journals say blind submissions, we don't want your name on each page. Some people will have, oh, we are publishing online, so we want block format. Nope. If you're publishing like a story, you don't have indentations, right? Mm-hmm. And so like Gravel magazine is one of those ones that's like, hey, you don't follow our policy. That's a really easy way to say no. We tell you we publish in block format for a reason. Yeah. So it's really important to familiarize yourself with each of the journal's policies. What are their submission guidelines, and make sure that you follow those instructions to a T.
Wow.
So yeah, that would be my #1 piece of advice to anybody submitting.
That's really cool. Like, you know, now that I'm thinking about it, I'm looking back at all the times that I've submitted, and I'm like, you know, there's kind of, I think we've talked about this before. There's a bit of a conflict between getting as much stuff out there as you can and editing it so that it's perfect. And I'm starting to realize, like, if I went back and I thought about it, there's probably all sorts of little small things that could have disqualified me in all these different areas. And I'm like, game plan change. That's fantastic. I can't thank you enough for that. That's great.
Cool. I'll also say I know we've had conversations before about simultaneous submissions. Yeah. And you've always had a complicated relationship with them. I kind of want to mention those real quick if I could. Mm-hmm. Okay, so with simultaneous submissions, back in the day when I started studying poetry, there was a big taboo about simultaneous submissions as well. I studied under a poet named John Rep at Edinburgh University in Pennsylvania, and he was very old school. You know, you don't publish in online journals. You don't do simultaneous submissions. You follow guidelines to a T. He was very rigid about these are the expectations if you want to be taken seriously in this field. Now, the thing is, 10 years out, well, I guess now it's 11 years out from my undergraduate degree, like it's now a totally different game plan, right? Instead of submitting to journals before, when I was in undergrad, we were still sending snail mail submissions. And simultaneous submissions were a big problem because you couldn't get information to the editors in a timely fashion, right? Yeah. You're like, hey, I sent a snail mail thing 3 months ago. I just got a response. It's going to be published in this magazine. That magazine is released the same month as this other magazine, and now it's accepted in 2. That's a problem. But when you have email and electronic submissions, it's really easy to withdraw your submissions. So even in Hitchlit, we had probably 30 withdrawals from the consideration pool, just because they were published in other magazines. And that's cool. And because of email, it makes it really easy to just pull them out of the pool, right? Because you get timely information. So if a journal says do not use simultaneous submissions, like Poetry Magazine, which you were talking about before, I think is like, don't do simultaneous submissions. Because they're a big magazine. They get a lot of submissions. If you do simultaneous submissions, they move like a freaking glacier, all right? So I've submitted to them a few times, and I've often withdrawn my stuff from consideration because it's just taking too long for them to get through it. They're saying 6 months before it's even in the submittable portal, before it says in progress. Mm.
So, that's something I've kind of run into a couple of times. I've got something with a publication that I absolutely love. It's The Bitter Southerner. Oh, they're so awesome.
Yeah.
But it's taking forever, and it's like I'm not annoyed about the fact that it's taking a long time. It's just I can't stop thinking about all the other stuff I could do with this piece, and I'm like, kind of at war with myself. And while I'm on that note, just real quick, I think I need to make an apology to Poetry Magazine.
Okay.
Right? You can do no wrong. All right, let's actually move on. This has been great though. I wanted to ask you about some of your personal projects. What are you working on right now?
Right now, I'm working on a rewrite of a novel that I started. I decided I wanted to shift a little bit into the arena of prose, so I'm writing that under a pen name. So my pen name persona is working on that, but my me persona is pulling together a collection of poetry for a full volume. I'm submitting that to some publishers this month, and so I'm working on that constantly. Concurrently, I guess, you know, poetry is something that always happens. I got into it because you could do it in little sprints, right?
Yeah.
You can work on a poem, and if you take about a week with it, you can probably rough out a draft in a couple of days, and you can refine it, and you can get it to a place where it feels somewhat like a poem by the end of the week.
Yeah.
Can't really do that with a novel, you know. It's kind of a bigger thing. So yeah. So right now I'm pulling some things together for that. So.
Cool.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, poetry, I've always said, and this is going to be a little crude, but, you know, what does it matter? I've always said that for me, poetry is kind of like a bodily function. Like, yeah, like it's almost like vomiting or something worse. Because, like, every once in a while, I just have to expunge this incredibly negative emotion. And I'm realizing that, like, who on their right mind would buy this now? Right? Like,
yeah. It's a little surreal when I do a reading and somebody actually wants to buy the book afterwards. Like, that's still surreal. It's so I give extremely good discounts at in those situations. I did a reading at Barron County up here in Wisconsin, and afterwards I had about 10 students come up to me and they're like, "Do you have some books?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I always have books." And can we buy some? And I'm like, "You have money? What is this? I don't know where I'm at." So I'll sell them to students, usually for a significant discount, because I want to encourage this behavior. But yeah, it's always surreal when somebody actually pays for something that you wrote. So
yeah, I actually I tell this joke, and for me it's always funny, but I think it's becoming less funny every time I tell it. When I'm like, yeah, I've published a few books on Amazon, and I've made enough money to take my wife out to a really fancy restaurant.
You know, that's me in the traditional publishing sphere.
Really?
I got my royalty check from an edited collection that I published with Utah State University Press last year, and my cut of the royalties was like $40. It was like, yeah. And so every 6 months I get like a $40 check. And it's nice. It's a nice gesture, but it doesn't quite make up for the time that I poured into creating that thing. But
it is what it is. You know, one day I hope to be able to make enough to eat when I take my wife out to eat. I would like to eat too.
Yeah, that would be nice. Yeah, pipe dreams, man.
Absolutely. Let's scratch the old nerd itch here. And this is a really unfair question to ask, but I'm going to ask it anyway.
Yeah.
Who's your favorite poet?
Oh, gosh. Bob Hickok. Bob Hickok. One of my favorite poems is Calling Him Back from Layoff. And I think it's just a fantastic poem. It deals with a lot of the working class issues that we dealt with in the last election, right? What is it like to be a blue-collar worker in America in an industry that's dying, right? And Bob Hickok used to work in these industries, right? He used to work as a manager at some kind of auto plant, I think. He was from Detroit. And so he writes Calling Him Back from Layoff. At the time when he was a manager making a call, he had 7 employees laid off, according to the poem, if I'm paraphrasing the poem. Had seven employees were laid off, and he could call one back, right? Wow. And so it's that heavy sensation of when he calls them back, he starts talking about the rhythmic breathing that he hears on the phone, of how the whiskers are scratching the earpiece clean, as the person says in one exhaled prayer and one whisper, "Oh my God, thank you so much," you know. And it's like this, you have this person that's in complete desperation, and Bob Hickok in the poem says something along the lines of, You know, I tried to show by the shape of my silence that I understood, right?
Wow.
And you know, it's that very heavy nature of the poem. He writes humor into his poems. He gets political with his poems. There's comedy in the poems. So as he's talking about that, he's like, you know, NASCAR, the guy he's calling on the phone, he's painting this picture of him watching a NASCAR event. He's like, so he's watching cars painted with ads with Tide, follow cars painted with ads for Budweiser, around a circle that's a metaphor for life, because most of us will run out of gas and get stuck sitting in the stands shouting for, we want crowd on our dog, you know? So there's a little humor in there, and he meshes that so beautifully with this very concrete, very heavy situation that he's undertaking, right? And he starts talking about, you know, as he gives this person, as a steak sizzles in this guy's kitchen, like there are 7 other forks that are going naked. You know, just great phrasing, great wordplay. Just, I would say by far that's probably one of my favorite contemporary poems, and one of my most favorite living poets is Bob Hickok.
That is awesome. I'm totally looking him up now. Like, I gotta go help him take his wife out to dinner. You know what I mean? He is amazing.
His one book, Animal Soul, I think was the runner-up for the National Book Award a few years ago. But, you know, like any poet, you know, you take the 5 most famous living poets and you put them on a street in any downtown of any place in America, and nobody's going to know who they are.
Yeah.
So, but he's really phenomenal.
You know, that actually kind of weirdly leads into another question I wanted to ask, and I didn't really outline this before we started, but do you think poetry is dead?
No. Poetry it changes. We have concrete poetry now that's now making this new resurgence, where things that we didn't used to think of as poetry are becoming poetry again, you know. I don't think it's dead. I don't think it's gonna die. I definitely don't think it's dying, because as a literary magazine, as an editor for one, we receive more submissions in poetry than any other genre.
That's exciting. That is really encouraging.
Which also makes it the most competitive, because if you're talking about, we need to have a balanced issue. So our inaugural issue was a little thin. I think we had I think we had like 16 authors altogether between 2 pieces of nonfiction, 2 pieces of fiction, and I think we had like 15 or 16 poems. And that was our inaugural issue, right? And a lot of the poems were, you know, some of them were coming from high school students that were trying to give this poetry thing a go, and it was kind of unfair to them because some of them were actually showing a lot of promise. So I also think that there's a need for more publications that are more specialized, things that cater. There's a few publications that cater to young poets, people who are under the age of 14. And I think that, you know, those kinds of specialty magazines are a great place for them, and maybe we need more of them. But I don't think poetry's dead. I don't think poetry's dead. The youth are writing it. Adults are writing it. People who haven't written anything for years are retiring and writing it. So no, poetry is definitely not dead. It's definitely going to continue well into the future.
Man, that makes me very happy. I'm going to walk around today with a little spark in my step. And I really like what you said about the specialized journals. One of the things, I read an article a long time ago. I think it seems like it might have been Clive Thompson. I don't remember. I have to look that up, because otherwise I'm giving credit where credit is not due. But there's this weird effect where celebrities on the internet, YouTube stars who were, you know, at one point like absolutely gigantic, have showed that you don't necessarily, in the arts anyway, you don't necessarily have to be a superstar anymore to at least a living or to get some type of financial reward for your creative output. And they talked about the virtues, instead of making it big, making it small. And when you're talking about specialized journals, you're talking about those things that people are writing more for the community and for the people who identify on the particular topic. That is really interesting, because it's almost like the YouTubeification of culture, which I think is really encouraging, especially because, you know, look at the venue that we're on right now. So that's of all the special, and you pointed out that the age group ones are are very useful. Of all the specializations, the special topics, which ones do you think are the most interesting?
Oh gosh, I think I kind of like them all, but I think the ones that are most interesting for me are the ones dealing with young poets. Those with those that are more emerging voices, people that are publishing for the first time. There was one called I think it was don't sue me if I misquote it. I think it's the Red-Headed Review or the Red-Headed Stepchild Review. Basically, it's one of those journals that requires you to be rejected before you can submit to it. That's awesome. Interesting because there is such great, like, you have to submit your rejection letter, I believe, with it to prove that it was rejected, and you have to tell them, like, so basically in your bio it says the poem that was selected for this journal was rejected by 5 different publications. And it's kind of cool because it's like that second chance one where, like, you've gone through the rejection pile, and I think in order to be a successful publisher of poetry, you have to have that thick skin. One of my friends here, who's a novelist, Kelly McCullough, writes. He writes a lot of cyber fantasy and fantasy novels and stuff. I sit and I talk with him sometimes about writing in general, and he's like, you know what? The reason why I'm successful and I'm one of those few guys that makes a living doing this, a lot of that is because I am more confident in my work, and I just assume that if somebody doesn't like it, they don't know what they're talking about, right? And
that's great.
Right, and because he approaches life with that kind of attitude, he's like, no, somebody's going to publish this novel. Of course they're going to publish this novel because the novel's great. Oh, it got a rejection? Well, tough for them. It's going to be awesome. And that's kind of the attitude that you have to have. Like, you get a rejection, and you're like, in a good year, I get 10 acceptances of poems. Like, I'll have, 10%, not 10 poems would be an amazing year. 10% acceptance rate on my poem, which means, on a good year, I'm submitting maybe submitting to 60 journals, and I'm getting accepted to 5, 4, right? Yeah. So it's crazy because, I mean, it's that competitive, but if you just let the rejections get to you and you let them eat at you, the thing is, you don't necessarily know why it was rejected. You never get feedback from the editors, which I, as a writer, I find annoying. I had a Villanelle that I was pitching for forever because Villanelle is such a specialized kind of poem, and not everybody's going to publish those, right? So I'd submit it to a bunch of journals that I thought were publishing forms, like formal form poetry, and they're just like, no, we don't want it. Sorry, it doesn't quite fit with what we need this term, or it doesn't fit with what we need now for this reading period. And it just now was picked up by Junto magazine, and that I've been trying to get published for over a decade.
Wow. That's been, I've had a few bits of feedback. The only feedback I've ever gotten was for my science fiction stories.
Okay.
And the feedback I got was always, with a rejection. And there's been a few that actually said, submit these other places. And I never did, and I don't know why. But I actually hung that feedback on my wall.
Mm-hmm.
And that was something that always made me feel so good, because I was like, oh my gosh, there's a human on the other end of this thing,
Yeah.
So, listen, I can't thank you enough for the insight that you've brought us here today. I'm so excited to have this as the first episode. And I'm kind of running out of time here now, but real quick, I would love to have you on again, especially if something huge happens and we can just kind of banter about it. We can, you're awesome. But what I wanted to leave off on was this. If my viewers want to buy your writing, where can they go to buy it, and what would you recommend?
Well, if you're into poetry, you can buy Breathe Automatic. It's my chapbook. It's my most recent chapbook of poetry. It is available at only the finest bookstores, brick and mortar. I think there are 3 nationwide that carry it, most of them in Wisconsin and Minnesota. But it's available online. Usually you can buy it through Amazon. My publisher has an Amazon account. It's a small press, finishing line press. Publish a lot of poetry. They got a lot of great poets out there that have great chapbooks coming from them. They have a women's voices issue that actually they're accepting reading fee free. Like, so they're not charging the $15 reading fee for that one, but it's a women's writers chapbook series that comes out I think every year, which is kind of cool. So Finishing Line Press, you can go to their website, you can order it. You can order it on Amazon usually, and if you really wanted to, you can just email me and pay me through PayPal, and I will send you a signed copy.
Awesome. Thank you very much, man. You are my hero.
Okay.
All right. Goodbye, everyone.